companies to get involved in diversifying their CSR to agriculture projects, because there is a profit, there's a commercial value to all companies getting involved in it. They already have skills, they have the training in health and safety, they have the capability to, I suppose, access markets, and instead of funding hospitals that the communities cannot afford to go to, they can fund agriculture, irrigation, and modern technology. They can recycle their tanks and their products, their instruments that they use for agriculture storage facilities. There's an interlinked benefit that can come from all companies, all mining companies partnering with agricultural communities. And I suppose I emphasize having this partnership, collaborative partnership, separate from the government's involvement. You can use community development agreements that companies probably already use with communities, assessing their need and how to help them commercialize the agriculture sector in their eyes. That way you foster success.
Okay, and Ibaka, what does success look like in your mind?
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think the first step is for companies to actually minimize some of their negative impact, because we all know that mining companies and other companies in the extractive sector actually have positive impact in terms of employment, in terms of skills and all that. But the first stage is trying to minimize their impact. So if you minimize your impact at first, to some extent the environment is sustainable. And then there's this term in law called the planetary boundaries. It indicates that for there to be sustainable development, companies need to operate within the planetary boundaries. Once you extend beyond those planetary boundaries, then it affects, our health in terms of climate change, in terms of source of livelihood, and it also even leads to displacement in some situations. So the first thing is companies need to minimize their impact. Now, when you minimize your impact, then you can engage in CSR. And when I'm talking about CSR, it's not just about box ticking. They need to actually follow these initiatives and not just engage in box ticking approaches. That way, companies that are actually engaged in ESG to some extent have a competitive advantage over their other counterparts. Because for instance, if you actually engage in CSR that is core to your industry, in terms, for example, mining companies and environment, if they actually pay attention to the environmental issues, the members of the community will, other sectors will boast in terms of agriculture, like Rona said, and there are other areas, and they're able to commercialize this, and it will lead to, export for the country. And then, because most countries, for example, we have the Democratic Republic of Congo, the 80% of their export is mining, and according to World Bank, about 64% of the population live in abject poverty. Now, we know that the mining corporations add value, but how about the 64% of population that are living in poverty? So if to some extent we try to minimize their impact and also empower the members of the community to some extent, that can lead to sustainable long-term economic development as well.
Fantastic, thank you. We're moving towards the end, so if any of you have any questions, please think about them now. And I'm just going to wrap up with some of the key themes, I think. I mean, we've obviously heard the message loud and clear. You need to start early, do those assessments, think ahead, start communicating with the local community, assess those needs, make them relevant, not just skills, but also think about technology transfer and really think about those activities on the ground like agriculture. That was a theme that came across very strongly. Whatever you do, measure it, I think is probably a key message to come out of this, and it's clear that KPIs and the use of targets is a really clear sort of activity that we should all be doing, and also just think right through all different phases of the project, right through to when you eventually withdraw or move to a different phase of the operation. So some good themes and hopefully some takeaways coming out from that. So if we could just open up the floor to questions. Have we got someone with a microphone? We've got a gentleman over there. We've got a few minutes. Oh, look at that, green light's just started flashing. Perfect timing for a few questions from the audience over on that side. If you could also just introduce yourself as well.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mobeen Rafiq. It's a very interesting session I attended yesterday and today. And I think we I just want to go back to John. He talked about poverty and extremism there. I think poverty is actually the biggest terrorist. But you know what Kim and Rona was talking about is poverty. I think first of all, she mentioned about environmental problem. I think Africa, if we can leave Africa for the time being about the environment, the main biggest problem there is poverty. Now, how do we alleviate poverty? Now, all the mining companies are going there, already been doing business for hundreds of years. But the problem is that as a CSR responsibility, all these multinationals are supposed to set up, how do you alleviate poverty? The only way you can do it by creating jobs. And when you create jobs, not only in mining industry, but you need to look after the community also. Because if community is happy, if they are prosperous, then there's absolutely no problem. And there's no poverty, there's no terrorism. So the only way you can alleviate poverty is by creating jobs. And how do you create jobs? Is by having more skill. How do you produce a skill? By having more vocational training centers. If you can have more vocational training center, if you have more skill, you have no problem, because basically through CSR, multinational, they're supposed to spend around 2% of their profit into that. So I don't know where that profit has been for the last 40 years, been going here and there. So my suggestion is that there's been very interesting discussion on this panel. I'm very happy, but in the meantime, we all understand the problem. And the problem is that we need to be honest with Africa, and we need to, end of the day, not only look at Africa as a mineral resource, but we need to help them out.
Thank you very much for that. I think most of the panel, I expect, would be in violent agreement with most of your points. I think the only one that is maybe worth picking up is that suggestion about honesty towards the end and the 2% target. Maybe a suggestion that companies aren't being honest somehow. I mean, let me turn to John on that point. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Look, I think it's clear that a mineral endowment is an opportunity for a country to secure a development dividend. I think, you know, most big mining companies these days would recognise that and agree with it. The only thing I would say is I do think things like 2% targets, I mean, what we spend as a percentage of profits varies according to the price cycle. Obviously, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less than that. But it's a bit of a red herring, because actually if you look at the turnover of most big mining companies, for example, half of that goes out the door through procurement. So what you spend on procurement, or what we spend on procurement in Anglo American, is typically 100 times more than what we spend on social investment, for example. So what do you want to focus on? Local procurement or social investment? I know what I want to spend. And the second biggest item we have is labour. So again, do you want to focus on skills development and education? Or do you want to focus on the 2%? I'd say skills and education of the workforce and people around the workforce, including future employees. And then the third biggest item of expenditure for us as a business is typically tax. So again, making sure that you've got good local government capacity, for example, the ability to spend the revenues that are generated effectively is also really important. So yeah, so I agree with the fundamental principles. Skills are important. Mining is, should be seen as a development catalyst and managed as such. I'm not sure that 2% is massively relevant in the context of that discussion, though.
Do we have time for one more question? At the back, over there.
Something about microfinance?
If there's a microphone right next to you, yeah, please do.
Sorry, can I hear some comments from the panel about the success of microfinance around the world?
Yeah, we haven't really touched on that. Does anybody have a view on microfinance?
Yeah.
Rona, please.
Yes, I know it's one of the areas that companies get involved in when they're doing their CSR, providing microfinance to communities for their own projects. So they they identify a charity or an organization involved in even agriculture or any other project that they are doing, fishing, and they provide loans for those projects to go ahead. But there's an arm's length involvement. So what I'm suggesting is having the company, the mining or petroleum company involved in the implementation, monitoring how these finances are being used, because what tends to happen, you have the local governments or whoever's the leader that's been given that job to implement the microfinance, being in a position to abuse that if there's no monitoring from the company that's providing funding. So being involved does help, but they do provide microfinance.
Do you provide microfinance directly, John, as a company?
So we have supported NGOs that provide it, and it's quite often widely available in the places where we're operating. We're a little bit queasy about getting too involved because sometimes the interest rates that are charged that are required to make microfinance viable are very high, not necessarily something we want to be associated with. But we also find, I think, a bit more fundamentally that it's not so much the microfinance that's missing, because there are NGOs in that space, there are often government programs in that space. It's the bit beyond that, before local businesses are bankable in the commercial banking sector. So what if they want, a few thousands or a few tens of thousands or a few $100,000? Where does a business go for that sort of funding? If they don't have a strong credit track record, for example. So that's where a lot of our effort on our enterprise and supply development programs is focused. So, for example, in South Africa, we have a relationship with ABSA, which is one of the main retail banks there, where they have about $10 million of our money on deposit, and ABSA work with our enterprise development programs and apply their credit and lending criteria and infrastructure to lend out to the companies that are either supplying us or actually participating in our capacity development programs for entrepreneurs. And that's far beyond the level that microfinance serves, and that seems to us to be the big gap. Because if you can get micro businesses to being small and medium, then you've actually got a chance of a long-term sustainable impact. If they're staying at that very local level, it could be very dependent upon you as a company, for example, for business.
Fantastic. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you to my panellists. Thank you to you for your time and questions. We're all around for the rest of the day, so please feel free to pick up the discussion later on. Thank you.